Hello, my friends. Today I'm going to show you how to install and run Godspeed and run a service with Godspeed. So it's just an npm module, runs in Node.js environment. You do npm install. After that, you do Godspeed create a project. Godspeed create a project. So this will go ahead and create a standard Godspeed project in Godspeed's standard scaffolding with everything created for you, which will look soon. Then the next step after you created a project is install plugins. So in Godspeed, everything works in a plugin way. Your data sources, event sources are plugins. So whether you run Express as an HTTP server, or Fastify, or GraphQL, or a Kafka event source, everything is basically a plugin. We'll show you a list of all the plugins that you can use. And then in the sample project we are going to see, we will be installing a few plugins and having a look at them. So Godspeed follows few principles, we call them the guardrails. There are four main guardrails. The first guardrail is schema-driven development. Schemas are your central source of truth. You may start with a database schema to generate your HTTP GraphQL APIs, or you may start from your API schema itself, which is in Swagger format inspired schema, and that will generate not just your Swagger file, your Postman collection. It will basically even generate your GraphQL schema, so on and so forth. We'll see, but let's go ahead, install these plugins. Let's use Prisma in this project for an ORM. Let's use AWS as well. We'll be hitting S3. We don't use Redis right now. We will use GraphQL also with HTTP to expose same endpoints on both the services. We will use Memcache, but this Memcache I will not include because I will show you how to write your custom plugin yourself as well. We will use Salesforce, Express, Axios to make API calls. Okay, once you select it, it will start installing plugins. Okay, once you've created a project, this is a standard scaffold created for a project with all the useful files you need, like your package.json with all the plugins, then your .env file, ESLint file, gitignore file, docker ignore file, source code, then Helm charts, and even a Docker file is coming soon. Your docs will have your Swagger spec generated here. When you start service, your Swagger spec will be automatically generated. Test is your compiled code, and in config, you have basically your custom environment variables and also your default settings of the project. So let us start by the default settings of the project. Okay. So default inline scripting is JavaScript. We also support Coffee. You can use both. Default caching that we will use in the project is in memory cache. You can have multiple caches enabled, but there will be one default cache. You can override this in rest of your project when you make particular calls. Log. So this is your logging related settings. What do you want to read at? For example, PAN number is a sensitive information. You don't want to leak that in your logs. So you can read that from here. These are some open telemetry attributes you want in your logs for all the events in your application. What is a log level? What is timestamp format? Whether you want logs to be sync or async. Async is faster, but it doesn't preserve the order. Sync is slower, but it preserves the order like console log. Now let's go to the source folder. Okay, the source folder has these pillars of your microservice. The four main pillars are event sources, where you capture events. Okay, whether you run a Express HTTP server. Okay, um, this event source is again a YAML configuration of an HTTP server, and all the event sources used in the project are in event sources types folder, these TS files. You can, these are plugins we imported when we created the project, but you can customize, create your own event sources as well, very easily. And then you just create instances of these types. So this is an HTTP is a type Express. This is the port, this is some configurations. Then you want to enable authentication by default on all HTTP endpoints, then add at event source level your JWT authentication config.jwt.secret or key like we discussed. Then authorization. If you want to authorize all endpoints for role-based and attribute-based access control, you can write any kind of a workflow here. Any kind of a JavaScript, TypeScript function can also be called from here. You can do whatever you want. The world is your oyster. And here we are simply doing parsing the JWT token in inputs.user.object. You will find it. And then we are checking role must be admin or manager. After that, Godspeed also does, like I said, schema driven development. It's one of the guardrails. So you will see that when we create events, I will show you. You are setting up the schema of your events in standard called Swagger and JSON schema. Once you create that schema, all incoming requests from any event source must adhere to that schema. If they don't, there's a validation error. This particular thing is to customize the standard response for your organization for input validation errors. Otherwise, framework has its own standard error format. Similarly, response validation errors, you can write any workflow to customize it. Then this is my Swagger specification, Swagger information. What's my Swagger will open up on this endpoint, localhost slash API docs. This is my Swagger information. These are my servers, so on and so forth. The beauty is that you see, why do we call Godspeed a meta framework? Because there's one way to set your authentication and authorization even in GraphQL. And you will even see, even writing your resolvers, there is one standard way. Even request response validation error and log attributes you've set for your GraphQL. Then there's Kafka, right? A message bus. You've set up your Kafka as well out here. And these are the log attributes you're sending to Kafka. Okay. This was about event sources. Let me first show you a simple hello world kind of an endpoint. This is health check. On slash health, I'm doing on HTTP event source, I'm listening on post. If I want to even listen on GraphQL, you just need to add this and it will start listening on GraphQL as well, which we will see. This is the function event handler to call when this event is invoked. It's in functions folder, which we will see. Functions health check, check.yaml. You can even call check TS. Okay. We will see that later. I have disabled authentication and authorization on this particular endpoint. Now let's come to data sources. What is a data source? In Godspeed world, data source is either an API or a data store that you're calling. You can create any number of plugins of data source or reuse an existing plugin. Everything, just like event sources, all your data sources definitions must lie in the types. So if you look at, for example, in memory cache, here you will see that we are actually writing as a developer our own custom code for this data source. So even though you can use plugins supplied by Godspeed, you can also create your own plugins and your own custom data sources and event sources. This is just an example. And after you've done that, you instantiate different instances of data sources, just like in Java, you create instances of a class. So these types are kind of like your class, and aws.yaml is an instance of type AWS. Okay, this is my default configuration for accessing AWS. These are all the services I want to enable. This is second guardrail of Godspeed, configure over code. I must be not writing boilerplate for anything which is not my business logic. So similarly, instantiating AWS services also as well must be a matter of pure configuration. You can even override configuration at a particular service level to not use the defaults. So this is AWS. Then there's an in-memory cache. It doesn't take any configuration, is very simple. And Kafka as a data source, you know, this is what you need to instantiate Kafka. KYC is a type Axios. I'm using this service to do KYC of a customer. So I'm using an Axios plugin out here. Let me quickly take you through the details of Axios plugin. It's very important plugin to call APIs. So when you will write code using this plugin, you will have zero boilerplate. You will only focus on what do you want to send to API, what do you get in response. How? How will you not be writing in your code the authentication logic for your API calls, doing try catch? How are you saved from all that? It's because Godspeed follows configure over code approach. So here is my authentication configuration. This configuration is calling a function to generate my tokens to send in every API call. That's it. This my bank.authentication is in your functions. This is another type kind of data source is a Prisma. There you need to put the Prisma file out here. You could even use Mongoose or write type-orm SQLize, whatever you want to use. Here we use Prisma as a standard. You define your schema in Prisma format, even if you're using Mongoose, but using this, you can actually create your project's CRUD API, your event definitions, event Swagger spec, your definitions can be generated. Even your Prisma calls, like all your functions to call Prisma will be generated for you using Godspeed Gen CRUD API. If you want to encrypt any particular sensitive information, then you can simply annotate it as the rate encrypted. Its PAN number will get encrypted from here on. All right. This is security as a guardrail which we provide. So let's quickly see Godspeed Gen CRUD API. So now we are seeing the different Prisma files we have in this project. I will just select one Prisma file. It will go ahead and generate the CRUD API. I'm not doing it right now because I've already done it and enriched the definitions even a bit further. So lending service db.prisma has this generated and the definitions generated like we saw. Okay. And let's look at functions also generated for that. So functions are by default generated in YAML right now in Godspeed. This is COM-biz lending service. There's a loan application. There's a create method. Let us have a look at it. So this is a YAML workflow generated for Godspeed. This is another world we'll see, very easy to use as well, but a slight learning curve, but you have to learn only once, and it works beautifully like a charm because it helps you to save a lot of boilerplate in your code. So now I'm creating a loan application in Prisma here. Okay, so focus here. Whenever you write a TypeScript function in Godspeed, it takes two arguments. One is the context, second is the args. Okay, args is whatever arguments you pass to this function when invoking the function. Context is basically everything about this particular API call or event, right? It could be your inputs that you received. Inputs are params, body, query, user, and headers of an API call, right? Then the logger you are using. Then the child logger has custom log attribute set, which we saw in event definition, right? We were overriding certain attributes. Then even at task level, you can override those log attributes when writing your YAMLs. So those are available in child logger. All right. Logger is top level logger of the framework. Then outputs. Output contains, it's a JSON object containing the output of all previous tasks which ran before this task was called. Then functions is all the functions loaded from your functions project folder. Data sources is all the data sources that you have. You can use their clients and call them. Now let's come to YAML. So the same particular function that we saw in TypeScript, this is how it is expressed in YAML with actually even caching that we are doing on top of it. Okay. So these are tasks that I want to run in sequence. This particular function has only one task. For example, when you create an entity, you want to store it in a cache, right? So caching dot after this task has been executed, I want to cache the response with this key. So we are picking the ID from Prisma response and we are adding entity type, and that becomes the key of the response. And we are saying cache on failure true. That's it. Now, similarly, if you, there are other methods as well which we have. No, for example, you could have delete. If you've deleted an entity, you want to invalidate the cache. Okay, here I'm simply invalidating the cache. That the previous key we used to create the entity, delete that from the cache also. You could cache invalidate even before calling by putting a before. Okay, then simply one as well. One is simply get by ID. Here, if you see, we are doing caching again. Data same. This function is same. Loan application dot find unique is a Prisma call. Then caching is before. I will first look if this key exists in cache. If this exists, I will return. Otherwise, I will not return this. And similarly, search, update, so on and so forth. All right. So this is what you do. Now, if you look at logs also, the telemetry, right? So before my function is called, print this log. After my function is called, print this log. This is again open telemetry compliant. You're adding more attributes out here. Plugin is basically, don't confuse with data source, event source. This plugin is for inline scripting. You can write utility JavaScript functions like randomint, and then you can call them within your inline scripts at different places. So for example, I could call random int here. Okay, this is an inline script. I'm calling random int. Here you can call any JavaScript standard functions, but also your own created functions too. Okay, so this is about quick introduction about YAML way of writing functions as well. While we generated the whole CRUD API from Godspeed, we will now quickly look at the Swagger collection and how it works. We will start the project using Godspeed serve. It will run in the auto watch mode. Whenever you make changes in the project, it will work. One very important point is this YAML is new for you. Don't worry. There's a slight learning curve and it is actually even auto generated for you. But you have the full freedom to use TypeScript and JavaScript in your functions. And at the same time, you have full freedom to create your own event sources and data sources. See, it's a very interesting thing if I want to show you if we have a TypeScript function doing some API call also. I want to show you how we access Axios in an API call. This is using S3 actually, upload document.ts. You could have done it in YAML, but if you want to do it in TypeScript, you do it like this. Again, I get this data sources I've got, then I will make the API call on basically the data sources.aws.client.s3.put object. Everything of S3 is available to you here. .ts. So I was looking for how you call Axios. You will see now again like we saw calling database with YAML and TypeScript. Now we'll see calling an API using Axios client from YAML and TypeScript. So here in a TypeScript, if you notice, I have not included any Prisma client here, okay, because it is already loaded in context.datasources.lms. This is my client, and I'm calling simply Prisma's API, gs.client.execute. Okay, this is how Prisma works. You can pass your data, headers, query, params, okay, and this is some metadata that you pass. This is my method, this is my URL. Now, one important thing that you should notice here is that when I'm calling this Prisma endpoint, I'm not doing a try cache to refresh my authentication token. I don't need to do that. Okay, I don't need to retry on a false response or a 503 server error here. I can simply focus on my business logic, call this API, return the response. Now, if a retry is to be done, the plugin has the code how to retry. We saw this lms.yaml. Look at the data source LMS. Here's the retry logic. Okay, so no boilerplate in my code. Now let us go to how do you access the same call using a YAML code. If you see, this is the TypeScript code. Okay, this is the YAML code. Quite similar, lots of overheads are not there. It's simple, and you can choose what you want in your project. So now Godspeed serve, let's start the service again, and we will now go and check the Swagger file that we have out there. We will also check out the Swagger specs and then the GraphQL API as well. Both should just work. And with that, our current demo will be complete. So the project is starting up. I will also show you how the logs look like. So you remember all the attributes as well we set. We will now see things in action. So the server is basically, it compiled your TypeScript code. It is evaluating your YAML files, your inline scripts. It is now basically refreshing your authentication token for this data sources as well. And curlyfied logs is set to true. That means we'll see logs of all API calls to this data source. So it is taking time to authenticate each of this data source, get the refresh tokens on the project load time, so that when you make an API call, the correct headers can be set. So when you do logging in Godspeed as a local development environment, the logs will look like this. But when you do it in production, you will change the format to OpenTelemetry standard. You will run the command Godspeed hotel enable, which I showed you earlier, Godspeed hotel. To go to Swagger and check out the health check event endpoint. Okay, as you see, its schema expects a property called name, whose example is Godspeed. And this is my code. What it does, I do a com.gs return, which is just like return in any language. I am returning GS status, which we saw, code 200, implicit success true, and data is hello plus inputs.body.name is what I'm doing. As you see, this has got nothing to do with Express or Fastify or GraphQL. Now we'll basically check it out as well, how it looks like on Swagger spec, no? So here is this. Let's go out. This is my health check endpoint. I will go, actually first I will remove the name Godspeed and see if we get a validation error. Yes, you see, error bad request, must have property name. We go back, we undo what we did, and we send again. So schema driven development, right? Hello Godspeed. So what you promise you must honor. So whether it's a request or response. Similarly, everything else. So let's create, let's say, a user, okay? So here we go, we create a user. It will require authentication. Okay, let's see. It should give me an error unauthorized. Let's quickly get a web token for the same. This is a web token I have already created. Oh, this web token, I need to set the right things. So this particular service expects issuer, my company, audience, my company, and then role. Let's set admin role out here. Okay. Um, all right. And the secret is my secret. Great. Let's copy this JWT. Go back to Swagger. Set it in authorize. By the way, you can just import this Swagger in Postman as well, and everything should work just fine. Huh? So here is a Postman collection already imported from the Swagger. Everything is here. The same stuff we are doing there is here as well. So going back to Swagger. So we go to create. Okay, so let's go set up a PAN number. APG da 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 da, and this should now create the user. Wonderful. The user has been created with ID 17. Now let's go to GraphQL. All right. So now let us go here and here as well. So see all the GraphQL APIs are available here. Your queries and mutations. Everything we auto-generated using GenCrud API and then enhanced it, and any other events you define manually are here now. Okay. Let's fetch user. Okay. We go here. ID. I select the ID. User ID. I say 17. There we go. See, it's by 17. By the way, if you're wondering how the authorization pass, I've already said the header out here. That's why it worked. If I remove it, in GraphQL also we set the authn as JWT in the same way. It will not work once you remove the authentication from here. Invalid token. Great. So now we saw in this demo that how we were able to quickly set up a project using CLI, then use GenCrud API, create my whole project, and as well create my CRUD API, expose it via GraphQL, HTTP. I can use multiple HTTP event sources. This is completely coupled architecture, one of the four guardrails, schema-driven development, decoupled architecture, configure over code and security. Even look at telemetry, right? You remember all these attributes we were setting? FN entity ID is dynamically calculated and it's here. And so everything you need. So let us, even we had redirected PAN. Let's see if there's a PAN. It was supposed to be redacted. We saw in this project that how you have easily in like 10-15 minutes once you set with Godspeed, even when you're first time, all you need is a Prisma schema and you can get started with Godspeed creative CRUD APIs with best practices right away. Your everything authentication, authorization, validation, caching, open telemetry, everything works out of the box. So I hope you like it. If you want to use this project, it's on GitHub. Feel free to go and access it on github.com. Godspeed Systems GS Node service is our main meta framework, and the plugins are all accessible on Godspeed plugins, and all our repos are on GitHub. You are free to go check them out. So I hope you enjoyed this demo, and if you have any questions, please feel free to join our Discord channel and you can ask us any questions out there. So these are, as we said, all the plugins that Godspeed supports. You can also contribute your own plugins. Pull requests are most welcome. Thank you very much for tuning in. Best of luck and have a good day, my friends. Bye bye.